The Scottish Government announced today that it would be following through with Sultana Sturgeon's pledge to take the British government to court over the blocking of the controversial Gender Recognition Bill. The bill sought to enable trans-identifying individuals legally to change their gender without a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, amongst other changes which would have made self-identification easier. But when a female identifying biologically male rapist found himself in a woman's prison, Mrs. Sturgeon's downfall followed swiftly after. This is the first time since the Devolution Act passed that the government has blocked Scottish legislation, and it just happened to land on perhaps the most contentious of all issues. Well, I cannot tell you how pleased I am to have my next guest with me. Peter Tatchell is not a man I always agree with by any means, but he has been the most assiduous and courageous campaigner for freedom of speech this country, I think, has ever known. So though we may disagree, it's a real honour, Peter, to have you come in. I think the government's right to use Section 35. I think the risks from the Gender Recognition Bill are considerable and haven't properly been taken into account. And this isn't hostile to people who have gender dysphoria or who have had an operation, but it is to protect women in women's prisons and in other circumstances. And that logic seems to me to be very compelling.
Well, I can understand people having concerns, but I would point to the fact that there are now 30 countries, regions or states around the world that have trans self-ID, including neighbours like Belgium and Ireland, and further across the globe, New Zealand. And none of these countries have had any of the predicted problems. So I think the evidence shows that there's no reason for people to have legitimate concerns because there's no evidence to show that things would go badly wrong.
But isn't it evidence that almost as soon as the bill was passed through the Scottish Parliament, a rapist identifying as a woman was trying to get into a woman's prison who was in fact a man, and that showed the problem, that when you've got a rapist using a loophole effectively to get into a softer prison, that shows that is a fact that abuse can take place.
Well, that was an exception. It was a mistake. In fact, that person was never put in the general women's population.
Indeed.
They were in a segregated unit. But it was a mistake. But just because of one or even two or three or four or five mistakes, that's no reason to generalise and discriminate in law against the whole community. We would never do that about black people or Jewish or Muslim people. I don't see why we should do it about trans people.
I understand that, but under the Act, it wouldn't be a mistake, it would be a right, and therefore that rapist would have had the right to be in a woman's prison because, for all intents and purposes, he would have been deemed to be a woman just because he'd said he wanted to be. And surely that's a risk not just for prisons, but for women's changing rooms and for women-only spaces that women feel they need.
Well, there are clauses in that bill that make it a serious criminal offence for a person to fraudulently claim to be trans, and they could potentially be jailed for up to 2 years if they make a false declaration. And secondly, there are derogations where in certain circumstances, such as a male rapist or a person who identified as male but is now trans, they could be denied the right to be in a women's prison.
But I worry about the suggestion of a fraudulent claim, because that's essentially a thought crime, isn't it? That you're trying to prove, if it's purely on what you decide as self-identification, then the court would have to prove that you thought something which you were then lying about. And thought crimes are something that are very unsatisfactory as a general point of jurisprudence.
Well, absolutely. But I think, you know, I'm a man, I identify as a man, no one requires me to prove it. You know, I go into a men's toilet, no one stops me and asks for proof of my male identity and my male biology. I just don't like the way in which trans people are being singled out for this particular penalisation.
But therefore the self-identification fraud is not a protection, because you can't really question what people are saying in terms of their motivation, because they can simply say to you, no, that is how I identify. So it's not the protection that it may seem to be.
Well, for example, if a person claimed to be a trans woman and then it was proven that they ordinarily dressed and acted as a male, that would suggest that they had been dishonest, because under the legislation they're required to live in their affirmed gender for at least 6 months.
But once you've got into a woman's prison and you've got the better conditions of a woman's prison, then that's easy. And to prove otherwise would be extraordinarily difficult.
Well, you know, there are a very small number of trans women in women's prisons. None of them, as far as I'm aware, have committed any crimes in prison. They've in no way threatened or made women feel uncomfortable. They've been model prisoners. I think, again, it's a hue and cry over a lot of theoretical possibilities.
That's quite a generalisation that none of them have made women prisoners feel uncomfortable. I think that's quite hard to evidence.
Well, maybe, but they haven't committed crimes against women, which is obviously a fear, and I understand that fear, but it's not supported by the facts and evidence.
To what extent is this a balance, that you've got different rights that you're trying to protect, and that this is the hardest bit of rights altogether, that you have women who feel at risk, and you've got trans people who need protecting, and how do you get that balance right? Is that really where we are?
Well, I think every case has to be assessed individually. So if a trans woman, when they identified as male, committed a crime, or even as a trans woman committed a crime against other women, then clearly they should never be put in a women's prison with the general women's population.